Hi everyone, I'm Natalie Alexander and welcome to The Commons, our space here at the UN Library Archives Geneva dedicated to exploring questions on multilateralism. This is a new episode of our HiStories series where we explore the history of multilateralism with the help of experts as well as the incredible archival documents here at the UN Library Archives Geneva. On the 10th of December 1948, the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this year, as we mark 75 years of the UDHR, we're dedicating this episode to exploring the history and the legacy of this milestone document, often considered the foundation of international human rights law. This declaration, through a preamble and 30 articles, sets forth the human rights and fundamental freedoms of everyone everywhere without discrimination. And this incredible document was drafted in less than 2 years. What was the drafting process like? Who were the drafters and framers of the declaration? What challenges did they overcome at that time in history? And what is the relevance of the UDHR in today's multilateral system? These are some of the questions we're going to be answering today, and I'm happy to introduce you now to our speakers who are joining us online. Here joining us, we have Chitraleka Marie Massé, who's the Chief of Partnerships and Constituency Building on Economic, Social and Development Issues at OHCHR, which is the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Also joining us is Dr. Stephen L.B. Jensen, who is Senior Researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And also we have with us Danielle Hughes, who's the Chief of the Records Management Unit here at the UN Library and Archives Geneva. A warm welcome to you all and thank you so much for joining us. Let's dive in and look, at the history. Let's go back in time to the drafting of the declaration, which is actually well documented when we look at the specialized literature. But for many of us, perhaps we don't really know much about it at all. And when we look at the drafting of the declaration, it's often linked to prominent personalities from, the drafting committee of the declaration, such as Eleanor Roosevelt, René Cassin, as well as Charles Malik, just to name a few. But there's much more to it than that. So Stephen, I'd like to begin with you. Take us back to the drafting process of the UDHR. What were some key moments or elements that we should know about?
Well, hello everyone. I think there's maybe two phases that one should pay attention to. And the first is actually the process that led up to the UN Charter. Because the initial proposals for the creation of the new international organization from Dumbarton Oaks really had no reference to human rights. That was the major powers meeting in late summer 1944. So there's a lot of push and pressure building up to the San Francisco conference in 45 and during those months in San Francisco. And that is where we have human rights then entering the UN Charter. A lot of it is through the pressure of Latin American states, but also a range of civil society actors. So you have this new founding document for the UN that lists human rights as purpose and a vision for the United Nations. And there's several other articles that have human rights. But there was no agreement on what international human rights were. And that's quite rare when you set up an international organization that you agree on something there's not clarity on. So this, of course, brings us to the second stage, which is the drafting process. The Commission of Human Rights is set up in 46, and their work on the UDHR really takes place during 47 and 48. And that happens through meetings of the commissions. There are many of them, more than 80. There's working groups. There's also research happening within the UN Secretariat, looking at different constitutions that have Bill of Rights or other rights provisions. So it's taking place at a lot of different levels. And then we enter the autumn of 48, where it becomes a focus for the UN General Assembly. There is somewhere, I think, between 80 and 90 meetings of the third committee in the autumn 48. And as they enter that, they know how serious this is. The delegate from Ecuador says at the beginning of the discussion that this is the most important document of the century that they are negotiating. And so there's this back and through between the states during October, November, into December, going over each article, very carefully going through the preamble, coming up with new ideas. So it's really at all of these levels that drafting takes place, and the processes that kind of leads towards the adoption on 10 December 1948.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, there were just an incredible amount of meetings and considerations by the committee that was tasked with creating the draft, but also the third committee of the General Assembly, which was tasked with reflecting and considering and debating that draft. Could you walk us through some of the main framers, the people who were involved in this that we don't necessarily know about?
Yes, so I think there's three kind of types of framers that I would talk about. There's the classic group that we know. You mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, the French jurist René Cassin, Charles Malik of Lebanon. I would also highlight Peng Chang from China, who was a bit, I would call him almost like a Confucian Renaissance man, both very grounded in Chinese tradition, but also with an incredible outlook. And I think also a master drafter. When we look at the details of negotiations, he was really both a moderating voice, but also very eloquent in finding the solutions that led to quite a few of the articles finding their final form. And then there's also Hernan Santa Cruz from Chile, a judge and educator. And from the Secretariat, the Director of Human Rights, John Humphreys, a Canadian lawyer. That's kind of the core group that we know. I think a second category that we must emphasize is very influential role by the Latin American states. There's almost 20 Latin American states that are there during the UN Charter, the San Francisco Conference, and they're influential on these issues all the way up to the adoption of UDHR. And they do regional work. For example, the American Declaration, also known as the Bogota Declaration, which is an inspiration we can see throughout the negotiations, for example, in the third committee, in the autumn of 48. So they were always just a few months ahead of the UN in terms of that, and that meant that they had a huge influence. And the third group of actors I would highlight are a number of female diplomats, people like Berta Lux from Brazil, Minama Bernardino from Dominican Republic, and several Indian diplomats who already at the UN Charter are fighting for having an inclusion of women. So it's not just about men. It's not rights of man either. And we see here how just change of one small terminology, equal rights of man and women, actually changes the whole complexion of a charter or a universal declaration. So in recent years, we've had a lot more research that highlights the vital contributions by female diplomats, especially from the global south.
Yeah, it's really incredible to see actually the plurality of people involved and working for a more inclusive declaration. If we could also look kind of at the time in history in which the declaration was drafted and adopted. 1948, it was a complex world. There was the emergence of the Cold War, the colonial system in many countries, institutional racism in many countries, the question of the status of women, which you had mentioned, and more. In your view, what were the major challenges that the drafters had to overcome to achieve an adopted declaration?
Well, so all of those that you just mentioned are among the major challenges. And I mean, human rights are not, in my book, abstract principles. What we see through those debates are constant references to political, social realities in countries around the world. So there's always that interaction between the international and the domestic, even when you draft a universal declaration. And all of these issues, and especially around colonialism and also racism, seep into the debates. So I think one of the major challenges was this discussion about universality and the extent of the application of the declaration. And I think it's important to here highlight that the document we're talking about, until about 10, 11 days before it was adopted in December, it was called the International Declaration. Then they make a change of name that's pushed by René Cassin, also inspired by an intervention by Haiti. And it really changes a lot. An international declaration is something that takes place between states. Universal is something that it involves civil society, involves the whole world beyond states. And there was a huge battle over the meaning of this. Was it really in all colonial territories around the world? Yes. So there's a lot that weighs on the notion of universality, that even though it only came in 10 days before the adoption. And also the other discussion was about, was this document to be binding or non-binding? So they end up with a declaration which is non-binding, but there was also discussion that there should have been a covenant completed at the same time, so you moved into legal obligations. Now, again, the nature of this being a member state organization means that they had a lot of power and strength to pull back. So it's very deliberate that it's non-binding, in the sense it had its wings clipped to that extent. And that's why the history that comes after 48 is so important, also as a part story of the Universal Declaration. It didn't end on 10 December. The legacies of this document goes on. But all of it was struggles between states, the hierarchies that implied by colonialism or racism, but also changing, and this new kind of definition or new version of internationalism that the Human Rights Declaration represents.
Yeah, it's incredible to hear that there was so much, I guess, conversation and debate just a few days before it was adopted. Danielle, if I could turn to you now, we've just kind of talked about the plurality of actors and bodies involved in this drafting process, but also these challenges that Stephen referred to. Here at the UN Library and Archives, we keep parts of the archives of that drafting process. So could you tell us, what do the archives kind of tell us about this process? Is there anything in particular you'd like to share?
Sure. I think there are two major points that the archives can actually tell us. The first one is the diversity of the actors that actually participated in writing and in commenting on the declaration itself. It's quite rare that non-member states, as well as NGOs, individuals, were permitted to comment on the drafts of the declarations. So we see letters and correspondences from bar and law associations, lots of correspondence from women's groups and associations, religious organizations, as well as nursing and healthcare organizations. And even we actually find correspondence from animal welfare societies, all having the opportunity to comment on the drafts of the Universal Declaration. The second thing that we see in the archives is the evolution of the declaration itself, and particularly in the language that is used. And it's been alluded to previously, is that it was international and it changed to universal. And there is correspondence, as well as notes and marginalia on the archives that show the evolution of the different language used in order to get the best possible out of the declaration. And there is notes of language changing and making it more universal.
It's incredible. I guess for many of us, we don't know that individuals, society, civil society were really had a chance to participate in the drafting of the declaration. We'll come back to you in a few moments, Danielle, to look more at the archives that we have here. But over to you, Chitra. In 1948, Émile Saint-Lô, who was the representative of Haiti and rapporteur of the Third Committee of the General Assembly, submitted the draft of the UDHR to the General Assembly, calling it, and I quote, "the greatest effort yet made by mankind to give society new legal and moral foundations." So in 1948, the UDHR could be considered quite an innovative document and a success to have been adopted at that time. So we wanted to ask you, the relationship between the UN Charter, which came into force in October 1945, 24 October 1945, and the Declaration, which was drafted and adopted just a few years later. What do you think is the relationship between the two?
Well, thank you very much. I think that this is a wonderful question. And when I think about it, I'm almost tempted to say it's a little bit like the chicken and the egg. Because it's very interesting, as some of the speakers before me have spoken and explained, there were a lot of things happening in parallel around that time. Yes, it's true that we were in the aftermath of the Second World War. We had seen the failure of the League of Nations. but we'd also seen a lot of different developments. For example, the Geneva Conventions were around and in existence. We had a lot of other things happening, like the regional human rights developments happening. And as Danielle also pointed out, as did Stephen, that there were a number of people, individuals from all across the globe, who contributed at this moment into this whole concept. For me, what is very interesting is that what you said resonates with me, because for me, as a human rights officer, with the privilege of working with the UN Human Rights Office, which is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, if I think of the UDHR, innovation goes without any doubt, but it also is a word. There are other words that I think about it where I see that it is a very forward-thinking document. And then it takes the principles of moderation, tolerance, and understanding and puts them in a way that it gives us a roadmap. It's been referred to as many things by many people, a bridge. Eleanor Roosevelt referred to it as a bridge upon which we can come and talk, with different views come and talk about it. Many people refer to it as a pole star. For me, personally, I see it as a roadmap. Now, when I step back and I read and I think about the UN Charter, the UN Charter has a very interesting preamble. It begins with, "We the people determined." And I'm not going to repeat the preamble word for word, but if you look at it, it basically says that the current actions we have dealt with have brought sorrow to mankind. So here you have it almost in a legal document. There is a reference to sorrow. And by reflection, it means that human beings have a right to be happy for me, you know? And then it says, "We reaffirm faith in human rights," in the preamble, that the dignity and worth of every human person is important. Equal rights for everyone, man and woman, and very critically and relevant to us today, between nations big and small. When you look at that document and then you look at what it says is the aim of the UN Charter, again, I'm not going to list article for article, but I will just list out some keywords: international peace, friendly relations among nations based on respect for equal rights, cooperation, not only for international peace and security, but cooperation in solving economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian challenges. And as a one body, promoting and respecting and encouraging the enjoyment of human rights for all. The international cooperation in the UN Charter further goes into more detail. It looks at education. It looks at health. It's a phenomenal, fantastic looking document. And then if you step back and look at the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is speaking the same language. It's basically saying very eloquently, all human beings are one, free, and equal. And here you have it in a very simple phrase. You have that reference that in some ways is alluding to the colonial challenges. It's alluding to to racism. And it's in a way inviting people to think about equality and saying, you know, this is not correct, without being critical at the same time. But importantly, it promises economic, social, political, cultural, civic rights in all equality. And it says basically that these are the rights that belong to all people everywhere, irrespective of where they come from, how they look. It is a document which is a masterpiece. And for me, I remember as a student, and I'm talking about 25 years plus ago, reading this in one of the books and thinking, you know, really, if somebody from alien space came and examined our history culturally, what would they think is one of the greatest steps that show us that we were a global civilization? You know, I come from the civilization of, you know, the Indus Valley, and we say we were the first ones. But I also think, without any doubt, the Universal Declaration is one of the biggest steps forward, perhaps like the Ecuadorian diplomat and representative said it's the greatest step forward in the process of global civilization, because we're accepting that we're all equal. And as time has shown us, it is one of the biggest challenges of our time even today. So for me, the two documents are intrinsically linked. It's a synergy. They both feed into each other. They both inspire each other. And for all of us, as we're working in this world where multilateralism is often seen as a weakening force, I think it gives us the hope that more than ever we need it. And all of us need to put more energy into reviving this. I would also like to say that I think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and equally the UN Charter, but perhaps more, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is such an aspirational document that for me, it's something that I would like to see every young generation that comes up appropriate this document and say, this is ours, we believe in it, and we want to make this to come true.
I guess
I'm going to
that's
stop.
yeah, no, but it's maybe a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask next, and that is, in your view, to what extent is the UDHR universal? Stephen referred a bit to this universality, but could you share more about this?
Okay, well, in my opinion, I think we've always known what human rights is. Perhaps our terminologies and our legal frameworks may have differed. I remember if you look at the Ashoka pillars in Indian history, the Ashoka pillars laid out basic rules for us. If you look at the art of war, it also gave you regulations. So I think in some form or shape or the other, we've always had it. And there are many cultures that have articulated this quite successfully. So I think that sometimes when people tend to think of the current human rights structure, they see this as a Western imposition, but I think that all cultures globally have contributed to it. And now moving specifically to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I'd like to begin with where Stephen said, where he said that different voices and different personalities and individuals have contributed to this document. I'm very proud that a number of Indian women contributed to it. For example, Ambassador Hausa Mehta from India was key in making the phrases that would then go on to establish equal rights between men and women. Equally, there was Omar Lufti from Egypt. PC Chang, of course, from China was phenomenal, and he's considered as one of the 4 greatest contributors. Hernan Santa Cruz, the Chilean diplomat, was key in actually enforcing and pushing for the inclusion of economic, social, cultural rights. Without him, we would not perhaps have had the emphasis we've had on some of these key fundamental rights. What is economic, social, cultural rights? Water, sanitation, housing, education, adequate standard of living, all very important. Charles Malik, in his contribution towards education being a fundamental stepping stone. I'm also thinking there was the award-winning journalist from the Philippines. There were people from Iran. I think both Daniel and Stephen have also referred to a lot of the input from the Latin American states. I think that beyond the people who actually contributed to the actual document, equally we have all of these, 80 odd meetings that were done for this, where there were additions, inclusions, subtractions sometimes, because remember, this was also about negotiation of what was acceptable and interpreted how and why by certain people coming from their own context. For example, UK had concerns about colonial issues, or South Africa was at that time having a completely different setup of inequality, the apartheid regime that was in place. So there were also pushbacks. And so, like every other thing where you have a multiple number of people negotiating for consensus, there was give and take. But what we ended up with was, without any doubt, a document that was acceptable to all, where people all over the world had contributed to it, bringing in different aspects of their own experiences, their cultural understandings, the challenges they faced, or the experiences they had, where they wanted to ensure a better life or a better system in place for the person or the generations that would come after them. So for me, I think this is my first argument for the universality of UDHR. And if I may add over here, take a little bit of a tangent, go off at a tangent. You know, as a very young human rights officer, I was one of the few first human rights officers on the ground, a female, in Afghanistan more than 20 years ago. And I still remember, as a young human rights officer, this realization that wherever you go in the world, what do people want more than anything else? They want a life of dignity, and they want to be able to ensure that their children get a better life than them. And what do they want for that? They want education. They want a safe house where they can protect themselves and their families from. They want access to education, and they want to be treated equally. And of course, everybody wants good health. And for health, you cannot have it without food, water, and access to medical care where you need be. So within all of this context, I also want to say that almost every single country in the world has integrated aspects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into their constitutions, some more than others. But at some point or the other, almost every aspect of the Universal Declaration is integrated into the legal framework of many nation states, member states. And the newer constitutions that are coming, either being revised or being redrafted or or a new state coming into being, integrates very well the elements and the specific articles of the UDHR. And in addition to that, when you look at the legal framework that has followed since the UDHR, because if you actually look at the history of the UDHR as it was being drafted, it's very interesting because at the same time, there were all these discussions going on the what later became the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, both presented in 1966, but coming into force only in 1977. And that is, to some extent, of course, the challenge of the Cold War and the changed political dimensions that were there globally for us. But the fact is that they were already in the pipeline because they had already been thought of as they would constitute the International Bill of Rights. But of course, for political reason and the rapidly changing political scenario and Cold War tensions resulted in these being presented as three separate documents. And in addition to that, I would just say, maybe I'm talking too much, so I will try to be very quick on the last point. I think that because this is, as it says in the preamble, a common standard of achievement, that aspect is so much part of our psyche as member states now that it is something we still aspire to. It is without any doubt one of the most translated document in the world. And I think that speaks to the fact that this is something that is very critical for us. It was, and it remains an integral part of our lives, our everyday lives.
Absolutely. And yes, I think that leads on very well to looking at the legacy and the relevance of the UDHR today. So thank you to you all. We've kind of looked now at a lot of the history and the context of the time in which the UDHR was drafted. So I want to turn to you now, Stephen. As you mentioned, the declaration is not a legally binding document. And that was one of the challenges at the time that was decided. And as a declaration, it's a statement of principles. But as teacher just mentioned, it is the most translated document in our history, and perhaps one of the most influential. So, in what way did the adoption of the Declaration mark a turning point for the protection of human rights, in your view?
Well, so I think in the first instance, it provided a new definition of what internationalism meant in the post-1945 era, or the post-war era. And that's significant in itself. I think what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also did was it provided the kind of the visionary, forward-looking component of the very schizophrenic UN Charter that has pitted sovereignty against international accountability through human rights against each other as a constant in international politics since 1945. There's always been that struggle between state sovereignty and universal human rights. And the Universal Declaration is the starting point of that other component. So I think, it's pretty large scale both in substance, but also its symbolic significance. As that turning point, or that inspiration that one could actors have been able to go back to over those 75 years, fighting for it, and also it has that significance even when it's been undermined or violated.
And you mentioned the inspirational angle. Could you share with us what are some of the pivotal human rights treaties that have been inspired by the UDHR?
Well, I think we have here a kind of a standard response and something I would call a bit more of a more novel and more representative response. So the standard response is that it inspired the two human rights covenants from 1966, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That was always the plan from the 40s, that there would be the declaration, and then there would be the covenants on these rights, whether it was one or two was an issue at the beginning, and then there would be the measures of implementation, which made the covenants binding. That was called the International Bill of Human Rights. So we know that story quite well. But actually, when we look at the history in greater detail, there's two other aspects that we need to highlight. Before the 66 covenants, the Human Rights Convention that really set the major precedent was the one from 1965, the International Covenant on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Now we come back to this issue both of colonialism and racialism. In many ways, the foundation of international human rights law is on elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. That was set the precedent. That's where we got the treaty bodies through the negotiations there. By the way, those negotiations were led by Ghana and the Philippines that secured agreement around treaty bodies in an international covenant. So that's the second element, that is actually the foundation in many ways is a world wanting to grapple with the legacies of racism and apartheid. Now, I want to highlight a third element, and that is what is the aftermath of the UDHR? Well, in 1951-52, the United States and the United Kingdom actually tried to close down all the human rights structures at the UN. We're talking about the Commission on Human Rights, the Commission on Status of Women, and the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination. That's like a near-death experience for human rights at the UN, about 5-6 years into the existence of the organization. And there's a lot of work by different state actors, for example, countries like Haiti, Philippines, Chile, Mexico, Egypt, to save human rights there, but also among the experts themselves that revived the Human Rights Project in the 50s. And that leads to two major human rights covenants that we don't always see as significant in this story. They're important, but not as this main human rights story after 45. And one of those that comes out of this process is the 1960 UNESCO Convention on Discrimination in Education and the ILO Convention number 111 on discrimination in employment and occupation from 1958. Those that are flagship conventions from these two agencies, UNESCO and ILO, belong to a part of story of actually saving the Human Rights Project and in the 50s. And what these states that did that, they always used the structure of the UDHR that had been adopted, that had a grounding in the charter. So in that sense, it inspired these two other treaties as this part of a real contestation over the UN mandate in the 1950s, did human rights and work on discrimination belong to the UN or did it not? Luckily, the US and the UK lost that attempt, even though they drove it up all the way to the level of the General Assembly in 51, 52.
Incredible. Teacher, if I could bring you in back now to talk about the idea of the UDHR as a living document. So, I mean, the world has changed a lot in the 75 years since the adoption of the Declaration. Do you think it provides a solid basis for evolving concepts of freedoms today?
To my mind, without any doubt, the answer is yes. And I say this if one thinks about it. The UDHR has been around for 75 years. We have still not achieved it in its entirety. It's still, in many ways, there has been progress. And in many ways, we're still aspiring to bring about that transformation that it promised us, the transformation leading to a better world. And if I just look at it and I think about it like this, when I think about where we are in 2023, in 2023, we've just emerged from a pandemic that has shown us without any doubt that it's an unequal world. And we need some change that will respond in a way to produce a better world. And when I look back at history and I look at what was the reason and thinking in 1945, we were at that point where we were emerging out of a very, very big a disaster that we had never thought we would see repeated after the First World War. And here we were in the Second World War, again in the same position. And a number of people from all over the world, everybody visionary, came together and felt we needed a new order. And here, when I look at where we are in 2023, and we have the Secretary General saying it's time for a new social contract. And yet, what for me remains steadfast is the promise that the UDHR promise holds for us and the roadmap it provides for us. They remain as relevant. And now let me just break that down a little bit, or perhaps elaborate on it very quickly in the time that we have. When I think about some of the challenges that we have identified between 2020 and 2023, we've agreed that inequality is one of the biggest challenges of our time. Let's not look at the inequalities between states at the moment, but just let's look at inequalities between people within countries. And it's such a shock to understand that more than 21,300 people die every day all over the world as a result of some form of inequality. How many people die of hunger? We are again looking at a figure of about 25,000 people dying every single day all over the world from hunger. If you just look at these two figures and think about what we held as a promise from the four freedoms, freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom, and just say hunger is something so basic in our lives, and we still have 25,000 human beings, out of which 10,000, if I remember my statistics correctly, are dying due to hunger. 10,000 children die every day due to hunger. We have 854 people who are qualified as malnourished. And as a result of the last 2 years of pandemic, we have more than 100 million people, not a million, 100 million people being pushed into poverty. And then we have also, these 3 years have been the years that have given us the biggest number of multimillionaires or multi-billionaires. I don't even know how to say that. So clearly inequality is one of the biggest challenges still facing us. What does the UDHR tell us about it? It says that we need to work together. International cooperation, friendly relations, just as does the UN Charter. And that the inherent dignity and equal rights of all human beings that is underlined by the UDHR remain crucial to this day. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do, and we have a roadmap in front of us telling us how we need to do this, why we need to do this. And so for me, it's the fundamental freedoms, the issues of justice, whether we're looking at freedom of expression and thought online, offline, in the modern day context, whether we are looking at how businesses are behaving, I think there's a message there and there's a clear guidance there on what each one of us, wherever we are located, professionally, politically, ideologically, there's a clear roadmap for us. And so for me personally, I see that the UDHR remains as relevant as ever before. We have the protection of marginalized people, indigenous populations, we have climate change, which is going to result in greater displacement and therefore more need for greater cooperation. We need to ensure the right to development for people. We also need to make sure people are able to live a life of dignity. So it goes back to all these basics.
Yeah. Stephen, if I could ask you, do you agree with Chitra? And is there anything you'd like to add in terms of how the UDHR can meet the needs of our time in the future?
Can I respond?
Absolutely,
Because I would say, in addition to Chitra, that inequality has always been one of the major issues that the UN has dealt with since the beginning, and that's why it's also part of the history of the UDHR and its legacies. And I think it's important that we maybe dwell a little bit more about this issue of the UDHR's legacies, because they are really manifold. And I mean, it's a tough question for a human rights historian, because I could speak about it for hours without exhausting the topic. But let me give some examples, right? Because it's not just that the UDHR has been this constant in history. The 10th December also represents a day, Human Rights Day, that political actors have used to kind of take important political acts forward. Go to Argentina 1983. 10 December is the day where Raúl Alfonsín announces his government after 7 years of military dictatorship. And at that time at the UN, they were struggling with finalizing, negotiating a convention against torture. The next session in 84, the Argentine government, that because of the military junta had been maybe the greatest opponents of that, they change and they say, we go with universal jurisdiction. And in a matter of weeks, they finalized the Convention Against Torture. It's very deliberate that the Alfonsín government used 10th of December as a starting point for a new era in Argentine politics. Even though the domestic legacies became complicated, it's there as an inspiration for finalizing the Convention Against Torture. We can look at one of the most significant NGOs in the 21st century, the Treatment Action Campaign from South Africa, that was fighting for access of HIV treatment for people in the Global South. They created themselves on 10 December 1998 because they wanted to show the health and human rights links that were pivotal for survival of their own country and, I mean, across the world. So we still use the legacies of that moment 75 years ago, where the international community adopted this document. So I mean, a legacy is also a continued importance. And I really look forward to what historical steps forward we will take this year on 10th of December. But I mean, the legacies are really manifold and at so many different levels, from high-level politics to everyday aspects of people's lives. And I think one of the things we should also remember when we talk about the UDHR, we often think of it as idealism, and we put human rights in a box of idealism. And that's so limiting and so reductive, because in my view, and being a historian of the post-45 era, human rights in the UDHR is an act of realism.
Yeah.
And if we don't get to there and we handle as such in the way we deal with conflicts today, we will not understand the potential it has. That human rights in many ways is the grand strategy we need for the 21st century.
Absolutely.
That's a major legacy for that moment just before midnight on 10 December 1948.
Yeah, it's incredible how you say it is an act of realism, and I guess from the perspective of Chitra, who has worked on the ground for the UN, it is an incredibly real reality, the document itself and its application. Chitra.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, as we're talking, there are so many thoughts coming in at the same time. But Stephen, thank you so much for adding that grounding in reality. This is very much a daily challenge for far too many people across the globe on how to live a life of dignity. And I think that for me, the transformative possibilities that the UDHR offers us is also very concrete. I mean, if we look at it, the Secretary General is referring to a new social contract. And I don't know if you have been following this, and I hope, and I'm sure most of you must have. The High Commissioner, for example, in April this year, launched a call for a human rights economy. Now, what is a human rights economy? In many ways, it is the legacy of the UDHR, because it is saying the human rights economy, which the High Commissioner has launched a call for, is basically asking all member states to use their existing legal obligations, integrate them into their policies that they are using to roll out, whether it is education, health, livelihood possibilities, equal opportunities, to integrate them very well with human rights. And so in many ways, that legacy and the possibility and potential of change is an ongoing, continuous process. And it is really to ensure that respect for every single human being, as articulated 75 years ago, is still going to remain at the heart of it. And yes, we still have a lot of work to do as the UN, but it's not the work of the UN alone. We need to have businesses, we need to have academics, we need to have journalists, we need to have every citizen of the world, young people. Everybody needs to be engaged on this. And everybody, as I mentioned, for me, this is something that I would like to see young people reappropriating for themselves, saying this is our guiding light, this is our roadmap for the way forward. So thank you for doing that.
And if I can finish on a telling anecdote, I had the great pleasure a few years ago to meet one of the drafters, René Cassin's great niece. She was called Grand-Mère Mimi because she was an older woman when I met her, but she was a girl in the 40s. And I asked her what were her recollections of her great uncle. And she said she remembers visiting him when she was 6 or 7, sitting in his apartment in Paris on his lap, and then leaning back, and then feeling the iron corset that held up René Cassin's upper body because he was been seriously injured in the First World War. And he had to explain why that was there. And he just told her, I carry the pain of war with me. And I think that's part of the legacy that he, as one of the drafters, imbued as part of the wisdom of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It carries the pain of war with it. And what they tried to lay out was, what Chitra calls a roadmap for a better world. And I think when we look at the world today with a lot of wars and complex emergencies and violent conflict, there is that wisdom of carrying the pain of war, but also pointing us forward for what could be a better future if we could rally around not just the declaration itself, but the whole legal framework and the whole international system and the whole type of internationalism we built on the foundations of this document. That is what could give us hope, that we learn from that wisdom that was there in the 40s and that has been reproduced decade after decade of those who championed the document.
Absolutely, and keep forward. Thank you so much to you both. I'd like to bring in Danielle now, because a big part of the history series is actually getting to learn about the archives that we have here in Geneva. So Danielle, if we could just begin with the introduction to the UN Archives Geneva, could you tell us about it?
Sure. Here at UN Geneva, we have over 15 linear kilometers of archives that date back to the League of Nations times, all the way to present day. Our collection holds UN Geneva records. We also have UNCTAD, ECE, and OCHA. And more specifically to our discussion today, we hold the archives of OHCHR and its predecessors. So in our collection, we see parts of the archives for the drafting of the declaration, as well as the drafting of the international covenants. And those records are available for the general public for consultation. Luckily, some of the records have been digitized. So the drafting records of the declaration, as well as the covenants, are available online to the public through our platform. The vast majority of the other archives that we hold do have to be consulted in person in our reading room. Archives are not only for academic researchers and lawyers and UN staff. They are for everybody to learn from and to consult. This year, we had the High Commissioner of OHCHR himself recently visit the archives to consult the records that we're discussing today as part of his commemoration to the UDHR's 75th anniversary. For more information, you can contact us at Ask an Archivist on our UN Geneva Library and Archives website.
You did mention that for some documents, they are just here in person, but a lot have been digitized. So we will put a link to the platform in the YouTube description. But another challenge we gave Danielle today was actually to select 3 documents from the archives that are relevant or linked to the drafting of the declaration. And so, Danielle, that must have been a bit difficult to find just 3 out of the many that we have. But over to you, which 3 would you like to share with us today?
Yes, it was a challenge because there is so much that is interesting in the collection that we hold. So the first document that I chose is a letter dated December 2nd, 1947. And it is a letter from Émile Giraud, and it holds the first French translation of the Universal Declaration. And in this letter, Monsieur Giraud speaks about the translation process and the difficulties that they're having in refining the language used. And he also speaks to the fact that more work is going to be needed in order to have a true translation. Attached to this letter is the first French draft of the declaration, and we see that it greatly changes over time. This first article, the first article shows that it still says "all man," and as pointed out by Stephen, it is still titled the International Declaration as opposed to the Universal Declaration. This document also has a lot of marginalia and notes attached to it, so we get to really see the evolution of the declaration itself. The second document I have chosen comes from the comments section, and which is allowed various parties to make comments on the declaration. And I have specifically chosen the comments from the Union of South Africa. And as Chitra mentioned previously, that member states as well as countries use their opportunity to have their say. And sometimes there was pushback or there was an attempt to limit the scope of the declaration. This particular archives is one of the ones that has been digitized, so I leave it to you to come and explore the archives yourselves to see the content of the letter. The last document that I have chosen, and it's probably my favorite, and it also shows the different actors who were permitted to have their say during this process, is from, it's a personal letter from a private individual here in Switzerland. And he writes to Mr. Humphrey in April 1948. And he calls for 2 things. The first thing he calls for is education at all levels, particularly with primary school, and having an engagement with students from the beginning of their education all the way through university about the history of human rights, as well as ensuring that there's an understanding of why human rights is important. The second thing that he calls for is a yearly day of commemoration. And we have this day. It is the 10th of December. And he says this is a day where the world can reflect on human rights.
Incredible. Thank you, Danielle. It's nice to see documents from member states, but also individuals that actually had an impact. And we do celebrate every year. The Day of Human Rights. Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. We're almost at the end of time for our event, but Stephen and Chitroy, we wanted to ask you a final question, a rapid fire question for you both. If you could share with us what maybe is the most important lesson learned, in your opinion, over the last 75 years since the drafting, since the adoption of the declaration. Chitra, first you.
Oh, I was just happily about to ask Stephen if he wants to go first because he's still thinking.
No problem, Stephen. If you want to launch us.
Okay, so I might cheat a little bit and say what is the most important I've learned as a human rights historian, and that is that human rights was never a Western project. What drove the Human Rights Project, the International Human Rights Project, forward in the 50s and the 60s was a coalition of actors and states from the global south that laid the foundations for what we know today as the International Human Rights Project. And the major powers of the West and also the communist powers of the East were very skeptical and resisted that. So we really need to, when we speak about this story, to remind ourselves that global south were and not every country, but a important coalition of states and actors laid the foundations for international human rights law, politics, and diplomacy. And that is why we can tell this story of universality with some, I would say, almost some pride, because for many years we thought and we presented it as a story of the Western project, and it's been a major barrier. So one of the lessons that we have is how the universal nature of this project lies in not just the foundations of the UDHR, but decades of work that came after and laid the foundations and transformed global values. So we now have a rich human rights project that we talk about today, even though on a daily basis we see the rights denied, violated, undermined, and so on. But that's for me the key lesson that we need to carry forward.
Absolutely. And to you, Chitra.
Well, thank you. I would agree with Stephen, but I would also add that for me, UDHR's most important lesson for today is multilateralism, that we all have to work together. 75 years ago, the drafters who were visionary, and yet at the same time, they were very understanding of the challenges on the ground. They highlighted both moderation and tolerance and the need for working together if we wanted to improve our world. And if I think about the fact that some of the most extraordinary and far-reaching inputs into the declaration or the drafters, for example, came from women, equality between genders, sexes, the importance of education, the importance of the right to work, the importance of an adequate standard of living. All these have come from different corners of the world. And at the same time, all of these in the vision have said that we all are in this together. We all need to strive together going forward. And for me, that is the international cooperation, whether we talk about it with the reference of SDG 16 and 17, or we talk about it from the perspective of multilateralism. But I think therein is one of the biggest guidance and platforms for us that if we want to make a better world, we need to get our act together now. And like I'm repeating myself, but the UDHR is a roadmap that is of relevance today as much as it was 75 years ago. And it belongs to each and every one of us in every corner of the world.
I think that's a great way to end. There's, of course, much more we could talk about as we celebrate 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But for now, enough for today. Chitra, Stephen, and Danielle, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your knowledge with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today online for this event. If you'd like to actually see and consult the documents that Danielle shared, you have here on the screen as well is in the YouTube description a link to the UN Geneva Archives platform, as well as the link to Ask an Archivist if you have any questions you'd like to ask. You can also find all episodes of the History series here on our YouTube page of the UN Library Archives Geneva. But for now, take care, see you soon, and bye for now.